Why 1984, the name of the new album?
You read the book.
I read the book,
Hear the record. Now buy the T-shirts. It's more a statement of where Van Halen is at in 1984.
Where is Van Halen at?
I haven't the vaguest idea, but it's on the racks finally. It took us a year to make this new record, and it's still a week.
Okay, so let me ask you something right out of the gate. What if I told you that the greatest guitar player of his generation, a guy who literally rewrote the rules of rock and roll, once snuck into a recording studio, rearranged another artist's song without permission, did the whole thing in half an hour, and then walked out without a single dollar in his pocket? And that's not even the craziest part of this story, because here's the thing. When his own bandmates found out what he did, it nearly blew the whole band apart. And then on top of that, the album he secretly helped make ended up blocking his own band from hitting #1. That's the kind of stuff that happens when you're Eddie Van Halen, living smack in the middle of the most gloriously chaotic era in rock history. Welcome back, folks. You're watching Hidden Fame Files, and today we are going deep into the Roth years, the explosions, the brilliance, the feuds, and the moments that made Van Halen the most electrifying band on the planet. Buckle up. All right, let's rewind the clock. We're talking late 1970s, Southern California, and Van Halen is already starting to feel like something that shouldn't technically exist. You've got Eddie Van Halen on guitar, a guy who sounds like he's playing from another dimension. You've got Alex Van Halen behind the drum kit, keeping everyone honest, Michael Anthony holding down the low end, and then you've got David Lee Roth out front doing whatever you'd call what David Lee Roth does. Performance art, comedy, controlled chaos, all of the above, really. Their debut album in 1978 basically dropped a bomb on the rock world. Other guitar players heard Eruption and just put their guitars down. Some of them reportedly didn't pick them back up for a week. That's not an exaggeration. There are interviews where guys like Steve Lukather and even Slash have basically said their brains just short-circuited hearing Eddie play for the first time. Two-handed tapping wasn't invented by Eddie, but the way he used it, nobody had ever done it like that. Nobody. And here's the thing that people sometimes forget when they look back at Van Halen. They were not a slow burn. There was no 5-year buildup. They exploded out of the gate and then just kept accelerating. The second album came out less than a year after the first. Let that sit for a second. In today's world, artists take 2 or 3 years between records. Van Halen knocked out their debut and Van Halen 2 in basically back-to-back fashion. That's the pace they were operating at. And with Van Halen 2 came one of the most iconic guitars in rock history, the Bumblebee, a custom instrument with a Charvel body and a Floyd Rose tremolo system, gorgeous in black and yellow stripes. If you've seen any Van Halen footage from that era, you've seen that guitar and you just didn't know the name. Now you do. Now here's where things start to get interesting. By 1980, Van Halen had already proven they could sell records, but Women and Children, that album changed the conversation. A lot of people in the Van Halen community, and honestly a lot of rock historians, will tell you that this is the quintessential Roth-era record. It's heavier, it's more aggressive. It sounds like the band had something to prove, and they absolutely did. There's an urgency to that record that you don't hear on the first 2 albums in quite the same way. And on the gear side, because this is Eddie Van Halen we're talking about, and you can't separate the music from the technology he was building, Eddie started incorporating an ADA preamp booster during this period to push his guitar tone harder. He was always modifying something, always chasing a sound that didn't exist yet until he figured out how to make it exist. The guy literally built guitars in his garage. He'd take parts from one instrument, strip down another, wire things together in ways that made no sense on paper, and then somehow sounded miraculous when he plugged them in. But here's the open question I want to park in your brain right now, because we'll come back to it. While Eddie was going deeper into his craft, exploring sounds and experimenting constantly, what was happening on the other side of the band dynamic? What was David Lee Roth doing? Because the answer to that question is the engine that drives everything that comes next in this story. Hold on to that. Fair Warning and Diver Down. Pressure Cooker. Fair Warning came out in 1981, and honestly, if you want to know what internal band stress sounds like translated into music, that's the album. It's heavier. There are moments on that record that feel genuinely uneasy in a way that Van Halen records hadn't been before. Eddie was clearly going through something, and it came out in the playing and the writing in ways that were almost uncomfortable, in a good way, but still. You could feel the pressure building. And then came Diver Down in 1982. Now this is where things get complicated. Here's a stat that should make any music fan do a double take. Diver Down was recorded in under 2 weeks, less than 14 days. For context, some bands spend more time choosing the right snare drum sound than Van Halen spent making that entire record. And the reason it came together so fast is because a significant chunk of it was cover songs, not all original material. Covers. Oh Pretty Woman, Dancing in the Street. Little Guitars was original, sure, but the covers were what dominated the album's identity. And Eddie Van Halen was not happy about it, not even a little. Eddie hated the covers approach. He felt, and honestly it's hard to argue with this, that they were good enough to fill an album with original music. They didn't need to borrow anyone else's songs. But the decision was made, the timeline was brutal, and Diver Down happened the way it happened. What's interesting is that commercially it did. Fine, the covers gave it an accessibility that pushed it toward a mainstream audience who might not have fully caught on to Van Halen yet. But inside the band, the friction was real. Drop a comment below. I'd genuinely love to know which era of Van Halen you think was their peak. Is it the raw early years? Is it the tight, aggressive sound of Women and Children First? Or is it something else entirely? Let me know down there. The Beat It bombshell. Eddie's secret mission. All right, now we get to one of the most genuinely wild stories in rock history. And this one, if you somehow haven't heard it, is going to make you stop and just appreciate how insane the music industry can be. The year is 1982. Quincy Jones is producing Michael Jackson's Thriller. He wants a rock guitar solo on a track called Beat It. He wants it to feel real, not manufactured. He wants someone who can absolutely shred. And somehow, through a connection with Van Halen's own producer, Ted Templeman, Eddie Van Halen's name comes up. So Quincy Jones picks up the phone and calls Eddie. And Eddie, I love this, Eddie hangs up on him. Not once, not twice, 4 times. Van Halen hung up on his so-called prank caller 4 times, and when he finally realized it really was Quincy Jones on the line, his reaction was basically a panicked, profanity-laced apology. He assumed it was someone messing with him, because why on earth would Quincy Jones be calling Eddie Van Halen? That's just not the kind of crossover that happened in 1982. Rock stayed in its lane, pop stayed in its lane, and never the twain shall meet, or so everyone thought. So, Eddie agrees to go to the studio, and here's where it gets even better. That entire iconic guitar solo, the one that still gets cited as one of the greatest solos in pop music history, took Eddie Van Halen about half an hour to record. Half an hour! He walked in, figured out what he wanted to do, did it in 2 takes, and walked back out. Oh, and he did it completely free of charge. No paycheck, no royalties, just a favor to Quincy Jones and a couple of 6-packs of beer waiting in the studio. But wait, there's more. Because Eddie didn't just play what was written, he actually rearranged a section of Jackson's song while Michael wasn't in the room, reworked the chord structure in the middle section because he felt it was too static to solo over. He just changed a Michael Jackson song without asking. While Jackson was across the hall doing voiceover work for E.T. the movie, Eddie was in the studio rewiring the architecture of Beat It. And here's the gut punch. Thriller was so massive that it ended up keeping Van Halen's own album, 1984, from reaching #1. Eddie's secret side project literally cost his own band a chart-topping record. You genuinely cannot write stuff this good. Entertainment Tonight. Hold on, real quick. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Van Halen's wildest era, go ahead and hit that hype button on this video. You'll see it right there on the screen. YouTube's hype feature is a way to show support beyond just a like. It helps push content like this to more people who grew up with these bands and love this kind of storytelling. One tap, it costs you nothing, and it genuinely makes a huge difference for a channel like Hidden Fame Files. All right, back to the chaos. So, let's talk about 5150, because this is one of those stories that perfectly captures who Eddie Van Halen was as a human being. The man did not do anything halfway. When Van Halen decided they needed their own recording studio, Eddie didn't rent space somewhere. He built it in his backyard. Now, building a professional recording studio in a residential neighborhood is not exactly something your local zoning board is going to rubber stamp. So Eddie got a little creative with the paperwork. He told the city he was building a racquetball court. A racquetball court. That's what the permit said. And you know what? It worked. Nobody came knocking. Nobody questioned why the racquetball court required such elaborate soundproofing and cable routing. But here's the technical detail that I find absolutely fascinating. To protect the recording equipment from radio frequency interference, because you can't have some random radio station bleeding into your guitar tracks, the engineers lined the exterior of the building with chicken wire, actual chicken wire, creating what's known as a Faraday cage. It's a real thing in electrical engineering, an enclosure made of conductive material that blocks external electromagnetic fields. Eddie Van Halen essentially turned his backyard recording studio into a giant science experiment wrapped in chicken wire and called it a racquetball court. And it worked perfectly. 5151 became where the band would record their final album with the original Roth lineup. And speaking of that album, the creative decisions they made in that studio are worth spending a minute on. The 1984 album. If you were alive and paying attention to rock music in January of 1984, you remember what it felt like when Jump hit the radio, because that was not a normal song for Van Halen to release. Eddie Van Halen playing a synthesizer, a sequential circuits Prophet 10 synthesizer to be specific, as the lead instrument on the opening track of a Van Halen album, that was a statement, and not everyone loved it immediately. Roth famously had reservations about the synth direction. He wasn't sold on the keyboard-forward sound. He was a raw, electric rock and roll guy. And here's the irony. Jump became the only Van Halen single to reach #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The song that caused the most internal debate ended up being their biggest commercial moment. That's music. You just never know. And then there's Panama, which is another one of those stories that's almost too good to be true. Roth claimed the song was inspired by a car he saw at a gas station. Not the country, not the canal, a car called Panama Express. That's the origin of one of the most iconic rock songs of the 1980s. A man saw a car at a gas station and wrote a song about it, and then told people it was about the car. And somehow that song still absolutely rips 40 years later. I find that deeply impressive. Think about this for a second, and I want you to drop this in the comments. What was the first Van Halen song you ever heard? What was your entry point into this band? Because for a lot of people in our age range, it was Jump on the radio, or Panama in a movie or TV show, or maybe hearing Eruption on a friend's older brother's record player and just not understanding how that sound was physically possible. Tell me down below. I'm genuinely curious. All right, so we've talked about the music, we've talked about the brilliance and innovation and absolute lunacy of some of these stories. Now let's talk about why it all fell apart, because that story is just as important as everything we've covered so far. The seeds of the breakup were there from almost the beginning. You had two very different kinds of artistic personalities sharing the same stage. Eddie was a craftsman. He was obsessive about sound, about technique, about the music itself. He didn't care about the spectacle. He cared about what was coming out of the guitar. David Lee Roth, on the other hand, was the spectacle. He was the performance. He was the reason the front row went absolutely insane at Van Halen concerts. He understood stagecraft and charisma and the theatrics of rock and roll stardom in a way that very few frontmen ever have. Those two things can coexist. In fact, they did coexist, and it produced some of the greatest rock music ever recorded. But over time, the tension between craft and spectacle started to become something else. Roth's solo ambitions were growing. He was already thinking about what his career looked like outside of Van Halen. And Eddie's frustration with the covers on Diver Down, with feeling like the band's creative decisions weren't always reflecting his vision, that was building too. The Beat It situation didn't help. It created a fault line. It wasn't just about the outside collaboration. It was about trust. It was about whether everyone in the band was rowing in the same direction. And by the time they were finishing up 1984 in that chicken wire-wrapped racquetball court studio, the answer was increasingly no, they were not. The final chapter came down to a few key disagreements: creative direction. Where does Van Halen go after 1984? Individual recognition. Roth wanted to be acknowledged as a star in his own right, not just as the frontman of someone else's band. And Roth's solo ambitions had stopped being a distant idea and become something very concrete and very immediate. He made a solo EP, he filmed a video, he was clearly preparing for a life beyond Van Halen. And so, the original lineup dissolved. David Lee Roth was out. Sammy Hagar was in, and the Roth era, this magnificent, chaotic, unprecedented era of rock and roll history, was over. Here's what makes this story feel even bigger when you look at it from where we're sitting today. Eddie Van Halen passed away in October 2020, and after his death, some of the stories that had been carefully managed or kept quiet for decades started coming out, and they paint a picture of just how complicated the relationships inside Van Halen really were. Alex Van Halen revealed in 2024 that a potential reunion tour with Roth collapsed because Roth refused to allow any acknowledgement of Eddie during the concert. When Alex suggested they at least give some kind of tribute to his brother, Roth exploded. And that was the end of any chance of a reunion. Anti-music. Alex described Roth's reaction as filled with vitriol that was simply unbelievable, saying he didn't recognize the person he was talking to anymore. Consequence. And yet, and this is where human beings continue to be complicated and fascinating, in August of 2025, Roth was on stage at a concert and told the crowd that Eddie's ghost had visited him the night before in his hotel room, turning it into a humorous, affectionate riff that ended with him calling Eddie his brother. Access TV. So what do you do with that? What do you do with a guy who on one hand couldn't publicly acknowledge Eddie during a reunion discussion, and on the other hand is talking to Eddie's ghost from a concert stage? You file it under rock and roll is complicated, and people are complicated, and sometimes the most meaningful relationships in a person's life are also the most painful ones. The legacy. What Eddie left behind. Let's talk about what this era actually meant, because beyond the feuds and the studio dramas and the chicken wire and the racquetball court that wasn't a racquetball court, what Van Halen actually produced during the Roth years was something that changed music permanently. From 1978 to 1984, this band made 6 studio albums. 6. And across those 6 records, Eddie Van Halen essentially established a new standard for what the electric guitar could do. He didn't just influence rock guitarists, he influenced pop, he influenced metal, he influenced jazz fusion players who would never admit it. The tapping technique, the tone, the approach to improvisation, the guitar-building philosophy, all of it became part of the foundation that the next generation of players built on. Roth's contribution to that era also deserves its full credit. There have been plenty of technically brilliant rock bands with mediocre frontmen, and they disappear into obscurity. Roth gave Van Halen its identity, his energy, his humor, his larger-than-life stage presence. That's what made regular people who didn't care about guitar techniques fall completely in love with this band. You need both things. You need the craft and the spectacle. And for 6 albums, they had both. The 1984 album alone, the last one with the original lineup, gave us Jump, Panama, Hot for Teacher, I'll Wait, and Panama. That's a hit rate that most bands never come close to across their entire career, let alone on a single record. You know, I have a feeling that if you've made it this far into this video, you're either a lifelong Van Halen fan who's been nodding along the whole time, Or you're someone who just got completely hooked on this story, and now you need to go listen to Women and Children first immediately. Either way, that's exactly the kind of person we make content for here at Hidden Fame Files. If this video gave you something, a new detail you didn't know, a fresh angle on a story you thought you knew, or just 45 minutes of being reminded why this era of rock was so special, do me a favor, hit that like button right now. And if you're not already subscribed, now is the moment. We dig into the stories behind the fame, the chaos behind the classics, and the real human drama underneath the rock and roll mythology. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. Hit subscribe and the bell so you actually see it when we drop new episodes. The Roth Years. 6 albums, hundreds of concerts, one genius in a racquetball court that wasn't a racquetball court, one secret guitar solo recorded in 30 minutes for a case of beer, one synthesizer riff that became the band's biggest hit despite everyone hating the idea, and 2 artistic personalities so different and so combustible that they could only hold it together for so long before something had to give. Was it a tragedy? In some ways, absolutely. The original Van Halen lineup had years left in them, and what they could have made together in the late 80s and 90s is a question that rock music will always wonder about. But here's the other way to look at it. They burned so bright, so fast, so completely, that what they left behind is essentially indestructible. Those records don't get old. Eruption still sounds like the future. Jump still sounds like a hit. Panama still sounds like a car at a gas station that a charismatic lunatic saw one day and decided to make immortal, and I think Eddie Van Halen would have appreciated that. Tell me in the comments, do you think the Roth-era Van Halen could ever have been topped by a second run if things had gone differently? If they'd stayed together into the 90s, what do you think that would have sounded like? I read every single comment on these videos, and on a topic like this, I know you guys have opinions. Let's talk about it. This has been Hidden Fame Files. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. We'll see you in the next one.